Used to be extremely anti-vaccination. Now quiet in favor. What changed my mind? I had a baby and had to make that decision for someone other than myself. I dove into the research and did a lot of soul searching. It was really just a problem with ignorance on my part. We are all fully vaccinated now. I was a hardcore anti-theist since I was a teenager, basically a rebellion against my strict religious upbringing. When I was in college, an older family friend of ours relapsed into drugs and started messing his life up, losing his family and house. My parents invited him to their church and he gradually turned his life around thanks to his spiritual rebirth. I'm still not a believer, but I have a greater respect for the social utility of religion after seeing what a turnaround that dude made. I used to be against nuclear power, so I then decided to research it for school, and it turned out it might be the best we've got until renewable resources get further in their development. I don't think it's the best long term, but I don't think it's the devil no more. My parents, who were green wavers during the 70s, are very mad at me for this. When I was younger, I was tortured and abused by a family member, and this went on for years. When part of my family, the uber-religious side, found out, I was beaten until I couldn't breathe, and I was told to never tell anyone or I would be beaten even worse. I was dirty from that point on. Irredeemable. Nobody was going to want me and I was worthless. They still brought me to church, but I was somewhat shunned, which made me really reevaluate how I viewed my religion. I grew up in an uber-religious family. Church 3 times a week with classes and meetings in between. Everything we did was for the Lord. When I started getting older, however, I started realizing that what was being taught wasn't quite what I believed in. Love thy neighbor turned into love thy neighbor as long as they're not gay. Help the needy turned into I've got mine, so politely go F yourself. Only God can judge you turned into everyone judging everyone about everything, and church politics took over. Do unto others? Let's go tattle to the preacher and complain until someone is kicked from the church. Most people fell in line and never really looked into what was being taught versus what the Bible said. It was seriously like a cult of like-minded beings, and since I was critically thinking about it, they turned on me as well. I couldn't see how horrible things were until I was away from it all. It's like getting lost in a maze and not being able to figure out where to turn. Once you get out, climb that cliff, and look back down, you realize every corner and wrong turn you made, and you can't believe how caught up in that mess you were. I moved out of state and married a wonderful guy. I don't talk to part of my family and used to think that it was awful that people ever died, or wanted to die, or wanted to abort a pregnancy. I thought that it was normal and natural to want to fight for every last moment, every last breath, even if it wasn't quite great. Then I got into medicine and nursing. Now I understand how valuable death is in life, how important it is that we have that choice and that option. There truly are some times where the life you are living is truly awful suffering, and it's cruel to expect people to continue on with it. It's cruel to ask a mother to give birth to a baby that will die, or to risk her life for one that isn't even more than a few cells. It's cruel to ask somebody who will never move again to continue living that way, just so we don't feel bad. Death is important sometimes. It saves us from when life goes very, very bad. I'm a conservative and used to be really homophobic, until I realized I live in a country founded on personal freedoms. And we shouldn't decide whoever the hell someone wants to marry. Still a conservative, but couldn't give 2 craps if you are gay or not. I was raised to believe in creationism. Specifically, young earth creationism. That's right, my parents taught me that the earth was something like 6,000 years old. And that concepts like speciation or human evolution were not true. I had the whole 9 yards, Sunday school to reinforce it, the Discovery Institute to tell me science was wrong, pastors to reinforce it. The degree to which they controlled the information that I consumed was pretty messed up as well. I remember my great-grandparents giving us a bunch of those old-time life books, one of which was the Life Nature Library series. One of these books happened to be on evolution. My parents did not review the books before letting me at them, and being a 7-year-old science geek, I read it. I remember showing it to a friend of mine, and explaining the patterns associated with human evolution, and when my mother overheard this, she snatched the book from my hands. My parents later told that everything in that book was completely untrue, and I believed them. Unfortunately for my parents, being a science geek, I eventually ended up in AP Biology. In that class I was totally ready and fired up to argue against the teacher whenever human evolution came up. What ended up happening was a reasonable explanation regarding our origins, with piles of evidence to back it up. That course changed my mind about evolution, and once that happened I started to question God's existence. My conversion to atheism was a long and drawn-out process, That ended with me moving out of my parents' place. Things are better now, as my parents have decided that having me in their lives is more important than me believing in God. I was raised to believe homosexuality was unnatural. I grew up around homophobic people, so I naturally hated gay people myself. The first time I encountered a gay person in public, I laughed and made horrible jokes about how he talked. Guess who turned out gay? Wisconsin had an election in 2006 where a ballot item called Referendum 1 would decide whether marriage between a man and a woman would constitutionally be the only legal form of marriage accepted and allowed in Wisconsin. It passed with 59% of the voters voting yes, and the state constitution was amended. I voted yes. Shortly afterward, I started thinking a lot. I started to realize that many of my friends were gay and I was friends with their partners. They were happy. They adopted kids. They volunteered for the fire department. They were nurses. I started realizing that their homosexuality didn't define their being. I was foolish and ashamed. By 2011, I deeply regretted how I voted. Who was I to judge how people were supposed to live their lives and who they could marry? Within a 5-year period of time, I completely changed my mind. A new movement to get the amendment ruled unconstitutional was formed, and I found myself supporting the group. In mid-2015, the U.S. Supreme Court declared the referendum was GMOs. I used to feel that they were unnatural and therefore bad. After getting a chemistry degree and spending a lot of my personal time studying food science, as well as working on farms and gardening, I think that genetic solutions to farming can be great. I still think that big farming is rife with horrible practices, and some companies exploit GMOs and patents on GMOs to the detriment of humanity, but I can no longer subscribe to the GMOs equal evil point of view. Grew up in the rural conservative Midwest. Raised in a family where God was everything. Dated a girl who, along with her family, also continued those sentiments. Religion never really clicked for me, but I went along with it because that's the community, and why wouldn't I? Everybody I cared about was religious, might as well. That changed when my then girlfriend's older brother, members of the church, and her parents organized an intervention for my then girlfriend. They told her they were worried about my soul because I listened to non-religious music and liked Dungeons and Dragons, and fantasy movies and blah blah blah. I was only 17 at the time, and it felt like my biggest sin was liking punk music and R-rated movies. And being that I was in such a small community, I felt pretty hurt and personally attacked. So I brought it up to the pastor at the only church in town, and he sided with the intervention, hand-waving away my concerns. That pretty much ended my relationship with the church, the girl, and the community. Got out of there, moved to a bigger town, met new people, new friends. Haven't looked back. Raised in Norway on the notion that marijuana is just as bad as heroin. Smoking weed was not just a gateway drug, it was the absolute devil, and if you even had one puff you'd soon find yourself in a ditch somewhere. I had my beliefs reinforced when I moved to Canada and saw weed-smoking classmates flunk classes and drop out and generally fail at holding their attention on anything. However, during a public speaking class, one of my classmates toppled my worldview. He was a great guy, funny, yet unsuspecting. I had never seen him argue for anything with passion before, but when he spoke to the class about the history of marijuana in the US and Canada, and how it had been demonized due to industrial interests, and then he reinforced it with personal accounts and statistics. I remember the end of his speech so clearly, it was as if I was suddenly seeing myself from the outside. Could I have been wrong about this all along? It didn't set me on a path to smoking weed, but it did make me reevaluate a lot of things in my life. It made me always try to keep an open mind during discussions and arguments, hard as it can be. Because maybe, just maybe, I might be the one in the wrong. And I must say, the feeling of having your worldview turned upside down is certainly not easy, but it's a refreshing feeling worth pursuing. If you really give an opposing side a chance, you'll find they often make valid points. It's been over a decade since I changed my mind about marijuana. I've tried it a few times since, and I let my family know it's not as terrible as they thought it to be. I do still believe it can damage you long-term if you use it too frequently, but I am fully convinced it should not be the super illegal substance it's made out to be. Rather than nebulous switches, I'll focus on a concrete one. Once I began working in healthcare, my views went from our system is fine, to socialized medicine ahoy. Seeing all the hoops people have to jump through with insurance, how poorly most people understand it, and realizing that for-profit insurance is for the most part a parasitical layer between patients and providers, for no benefit to anyone. Besides, the insurers convinced me that the American system is incredibly inefficient, and could only be designed by folks who do not empathize with their fellow humans. It also helps that I worked for a really large provider when I started, so I also learned that the few anecdotal welfare cheats were outweighed by the many people who were doing everything right but getting hosed by the insurance companies. So I became convinced that socialized medicine was necessary here. And once I believed that, and more importantly learned that anecdotes were less important than people, I applied that belief to the rest of my politics. And now I'm a socialist. I went from Team Bernie to Team Hillary when I went to one of her rallies. I thought her rally sizes were small because she was unpopular, but it was on purpose so that she can answer questions, and when she answers questions, she explains her answers in ways that make perfect sense. I really appreciated that. Bernie's rallies were bigger, but I couldn't defend his policies because he wasn't able to explain them. The venue was too loud for a Q&A type of setting. I used to be a hardcore, Ayn Rand-style libertarian. I have mellowed a lot, and although I am still a libertarian, I now think that social programs like early childhood education and some sort of wealth redistribution is necessary. The thing that attracted me to the ideology is the individualism, rejection of collectivism, and the belief that people are entitled to what they create. I still think that. However, my views aren't as rigid as they used to be. What changed my mind is the realities of technology and automation. 100 years ago we had a much greater need for human labor. And anyone that had the desire and ability to earn a living could do so, whether that was as a farmer or a factory worker. We are getting to the point in society where human labor is needed less and less. This should create excess and wealth that everyone should enjoy. But, it's having the exact opposite effect. We can now create food, goods and many services with a lot less human input. But the only ones who gain from the increase in inefficiency are the creators. Everyone is worried about job loss when these advances are a net benefit to humanity. That indicates that there is a huge distribution problem. How else does technology increase the supply of goods and services while lowering the cost via human input, and yet this results in more people suffering? Still, I'm certain a bureaucratic, centralized, collective solution like full communism is doomed to failure. Yet, at the same time, unrestrained capitalism and free trade is going to leave a lot of people behind. And not because those people are lazy, but simply because we don't need them anymore. I used to think that abortion was wrong no matter what, because that's what I'd been raised to believe. My mom was raped when she was in the Navy, and that's how I came about. Because she didn't believe in abortion, she had me, and I can honestly say that she has never once given me any reason to think that she loves me any less or more than my brother, whom she had with my dad, not my biological father, but the man she married. In her eyes, a fetus is always going to be a potential human, and she believes that life begins at conception, so purposefully destroying a fetus is the same as murder to her. I can understand her point of view, but after I grew up and met girls who ended up in abusive households where they were beholden to their husbands in everything, to the point where they didn't even own their own bodies, I thought maybe it wasn't such a good idea to make abortion illegal like my mom wanted. What if a child got pregnant due to molestation? What if the mother's life was in danger because of that? Or because of other reasons? What if the mother knows that if she brings the baby into the world, there's no way she could ever give it a healthy or happy life? I also know about the systems we have in place in our country for adoption, and it's messed up as all get out. It's terrifically difficult to adopt a kid, to the point where many couples will even seek orphans from other countries just to get one. If the argument for pro-life is to allow the baby to be born and then put it up for adoption, aren't you just dooming it to a life of misery, if it's not one of the lucky ones that makes it through the process? And what about the kids who are older? They have an even more difficult time finding forever homes. The more I thought about it, the more I came to realize that my mom and people like her might believe in what they're saying, but they aren't taking the thing to its natural conclusion. If they truly care about these babies so much, they ought to be for more federal funding for family care and welfare assistance programs, and there ought to be more of them adopting kids who need homes. My mom is very strictly conservative, and she hates any form of welfare assistance. It's really easy to condemn people for making such difficult life decisions when you have no skin in the game. My mom made the decision for herself, and I respect her for sticking to her beliefs and being able to love me despite what a piece of human excrement my bio father was. But when I was old enough to think more critically for myself, I came to realize that I didn't agree with even her basic premise. Even if each zygote is a potential human, how can we say that that's the same as a feeling, living, existing human who's already been born? The mother is a human too, and the risks involved in pregnancy aren't minor. She deserves the final say in what happens to her own body, just as anyone deserves the same thing about themselves. Because I believe in that so strongly, I've changed my position on abortion 100%. I believe that women ought to be able to make the decision for themselves, because ultimately, it's their own health on the line, and the proto-human they're carrying around inside them can't mature to viability without using the mother's body to do it. As much as I adore babies, I can't find it in my heart to believe that a fetus is the same thing. Not until it's big enough to live on its own. And until that happens, I'm not comfortable with weighing its life more than that of the life it might be endangering. Turns out, the world isn't full of Democrats on one side and the literal spawn of Satan on the other. Two things happened, in order, to help me understand that conservatives aren't racist, sexist, homophobic, bigots. First, I read this quote: "Too often, we judge other groups by their worst examples while judging ourselves by our best intentions." It really resonated with me the more I thought about it. Then, I actually listened to conservatives and libertarians speak. Not just waiting for my turn to talk. Really listening. Going into the conversation in good faith and truly trying to understand what the other person was actually saying. I'm still a Democrat in some ways. And conservative in others. I'd say I'm a libertarian, if that term hasn't been hijacked to mean something else, yet. But I started as a hardcore Democrat. I changed. But only because I really wanted to change and open myself up to different perspectives. By the way, if you like the quote I shared, remember that it's a George W. Bush quote. Take that for whatever it's worth. I used to be extremely anti-gun, especially anything non-hunting related. I'm not pro-gun now, but I'm a lot more indifferent. What changed my mind was honestly bad arguments from other people who were anti-gun. It made me look at it much more critically, rather than living in my own echo chamber